I stood at my daughter's grave with dirt still fresh on my shoes when her husband leaned over and told me the house I'd lived in for 11 years wasn't mine anymore. I nodded, shook his hand, and drove away without a fight. 3 weeks later, federal agents were waiting in his driveway when he came home from work. My name is Robert Hensley. I'm 64 years old, and before I tell you what happened in that driveway, you need to understand everything that came before it. Because a man doesn't get pushed that far without a story behind it worth hearing all the way through. I moved into the house on Maple Crest Drive in Asheville, North Carolina, back in 2015, after my wife Margaret passed from a stroke that took her from me in a single afternoon with no warning at all. I was 53 years old then, and I had no children of my own. Margaret and I had tried for years, and it never happened, and we'd made peace with that a long time before she died. What I did have was my niece, Rachel, who was closer to me than most fathers are to their own daughters. Her parents, my sister and her husband, had died in a car accident when Rachel was 19, and I'd stepped in without ever being asked to. I paid for the rest of her college. I walked her down the aisle at her wedding because there was no one else left to do it. When Margaret died, and I found myself rattling around alone in a house too big and too quiet, Rachel was the one who called me every single Sunday to make sure I was still eating real meals and not just cereal out of the box. Rachel had married a man named Curtis Pruitt 4 years before Margaret died. Curtis worked in commercial real estate, the kind of job where he always seemed to be closing some deal or waiting on some deal to close, and he had a way of talking about money that made you feel like you were slightly behind on understanding your own life. He wasn't cruel, not at first. He was charming in that practiced way some men are, always remembering your birthday, always the first to refill your glass at dinner. Rachel loved him, and because Rachel loved him, I gave him the benefit of every doubt I had in me. When my house on Maple Crest started feeling too large and too silent, Rachel suggested she and Curtis move in with me. She said it plainly, the way she'd always spoken to me since she was a teenager, no dancing around it. "You shouldn't be alone in this house, Uncle Robert. Let us come stay with you. We'll take care of you, and you won't have to sell it or downsize or do any of that." I remember feeling something loosen in my chest that day, some fear I hadn't even let myself name out loud. I said yes before she finished the sentence. They moved in that spring. For the first year, it was everything Rachel had promised. She cooked Sunday dinners the way Margaret used to. She kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table because she knew I loved the smell of them in the mornings. Curtis was around less, always traveling for work, always on his phone in the driveway, pacing back and forth during calls I was never invited to hear. I told myself that was just the nature of his job. It was Rachel who got sick first, back in the fall of last year. A cough that wouldn't go away. Then weight she couldn't seem to keep on. Then a diagnosis none of us wanted to say out loud. In the beginning, pancreatic cancer, stage 3 by the time they caught it. I watched my niece, the closest thing I had to a daughter, shrink into someone I barely recognized over the course of 8 months. Curtis was attentive during that time. I'll give him that. He drove her to every appointment. He sat with her during every round of chemo. I remember thinking, more than once, that whatever doubts I'd carried about him over the years, at least the man showed up when it mattered. About 5 months into her treatment, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, while Curtis was out running errands, Rachel called me into her bedroom and asked me to sit down. She was thinner than I'd ever seen her, propped up against a stack of pillows, and she had a manila envelope resting on the blanket beside her. "Uncle Robert, I need you to take this and put it somewhere Curtis will never find it," she said. I asked her what it was. She wouldn't tell me exactly, only that it was important, and that if anything ever happened to her, I needed to open it before I did anything else, before I signed anything, before I agreed to anything, no matter who asked me to. I remember laughing a little, the way you do when someone you love says something too heavy to hold straight on. I told her she was going to beat this thing, and we'd laugh about the dramatic envelope someday. She didn't laugh back. She just held my hand and made me promise. I took the envelope home that same night and locked it in the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. The same safe where I kept Margaret's wedding ring and the folded flag from my father's funeral. Rachel passed away on a Tuesday morning in early June, with Curtis and me both at her bedside. I won't describe what that morning felt like, because there aren't words that do it justice, and I don't think there ever will be. I'd already buried a wife. I never imagined I'd be burying the daughter I never had, too, standing in the same funeral home, picking out flowers from the same rotating book of arrangements, nodding along to the same hollow condolences from people who meant well but couldn't possibly understand. The funeral was held that Saturday at the church on Beaumont Street, the one Rachel had been baptized in as a baby, back when my sister was still alive to hold her at the font. Close to 90 people came, co-workers from the hospice where Rachel had volunteered for years, old college roommates who flew in from 3 different states, neighbors who'd watched her grow from a shy teenager doing homework on my back porch into the woman who organized the neighborhood's 4th of July potluck every single summer. I stood near the casket in a suit I hadn't worn since Margaret's funeral, shaking hands, accepting hugs, trying to hold myself together for the sake of everyone who needed to see that an old man could survive this twice. After the burial, everyone came back to the house on Maple Crest, the same tradition we'd kept when Margaret passed. I was sitting in my recliner in the living room, still in my funeral suit, a paper plate of food balanced on my knee that I hadn't touched, when Curtis walked over and crouched down beside my chair. The room was full, maybe 25 or 30 people standing around with coffee cups and quiet conversation. He leaned in, close to my ear, close enough that I could smell the whiskey already on his breath, and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest few people to catch, "This house needs to go on the market, Robert. Rachel's estate goes to me now, and that includes this place. I'll give you 30 days to find somewhere else to live." The room didn't go dead silent the way you'd expect in a movie, but it went quiet enough. I saw my neighbor of 9 years, a woman named Dolores Ferran, stop mid-sentence with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. I saw Rachel's old hospice co-worker, a young man named Marcus, go still and look down at the floor like he wished he could disappear into it. Every person close enough to hear those words heard them on the day we buried Rachel, in the house I had lived in and loved for 11 years. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue with him in front of the people who'd come to grieve my niece, not the man who'd spent the day playing the part of the devastated widower. Something in me went still, the way a lake goes still right before the first frost sets in. I thought about that manila envelope locked in my closet upstairs. I thought about Rachel's hand in mine that rainy Thursday, making me promise. I looked at Curtis for a long moment, and then I said, "All right." Just those 2 words, nothing more. I stood up, walked upstairs, and packed a single duffel bag. A few changes of clothes, my blood pressure medication, a photograph of Margaret and Rachel together from a Christmas years back, and the fireproof safe with the envelope still locked inside. I came back down 15 minutes later, bag over one shoulder, safe tucked under my other arm, and walked straight past Curtis toward the front door, without another word between us. He looked almost let down that I hadn't fought him on it, like he'd been bracing for tears or begging and didn't quite know what to do with a silence instead. I stepped out into the June evening air and walked 4 houses down the street to the Ferran place without looking back once. Dolores Ferran and her husband Sam had lived down the street from me for as long as I'd lived on Maple Crest. Sam was 68, a retired fire captain, the kind of man who still climbed his own ladder to clean his own gutters every October no matter how many times Dolores told him not to. He'd been at the funeral that day and had heard exactly what Curtis said in that living room. When he opened his front door and saw me standing on his porch with a duffel bag and a metal safe, he didn't ask a single question. He just stepped aside and said, "Get in here, Robert, before you catch your death out there." Dolores had the guest room made up before I'd even finished my second cup of coffee at their kitchen table. "You want to talk about it?" Sam asked, sliding a mug across to me. I told him everything, the 30-day deadline, the way Curtis had said it, low and mean, right in front of a room full of grieving people, the whiskey on his breath at his own wife's funeral. Sam shook his head slow, jaw tight. "That house is yours, Robert," he said. "You bought it outright long before Rachel and Curtis ever moved a single box into it. He's got no legal claim on that house, estate or no estate." I nodded along, but my mind wasn't fully on the legal side of things yet. My mind was on that safe, sitting by my feet, on the envelope Rachel had begged me to open only if something happened to her. That night, after Sam and Dolores had gone to bed, I sat alone under the small lamp in their guest room, and I finally broke the seal. Inside were 4 things that changed everything I thought I understood about the last year of my life. The first was a copy of the deed to the house on Maple Crest, showing exactly what Sam had already told me. The property had always been in my name alone, purchased with the proceeds from selling Margaret's and my old house, never once transferred to Rachel or Curtis in any form. The second was a printed bank statement showing a joint checking account Rachel had opened without Curtis's knowledge, one she'd been quietly funneling money into for the better part of a year, nearly $40,000, money she'd apparently been saving in secret. The third was a life insurance policy Curtis had taken out on Rachel 18 months before her diagnosis, worth $750,000, with a note in Rachel's handwriting clipped to the front that read simply, "He upped this policy right before I got sick. Ask why." The fourth was a handwritten letter, 4 pages long, in Rachel's own careful cursive. In the letter, she explained that 6 months before her diagnosis, she discovered Curtis had been having an affair with a woman from his office, a relationship that had apparently continued even after she got sick. She wrote that she'd found text messages on an old phone of his he thought he'd wiped clean, messages that talked not just about the affair, but about the house, about the insurance policy, about what would happen once things settled after she was gone. She wrote that she didn't have proof of anything criminal, not yet, but that something about the timing of that insurance policy increase right before her diagnosis, at his insistence, at a doctor visit, he'd pushed her to schedule with a physician she'd never heard of before, had never sat right with her. She asked me to forgive her for not telling me sooner, for not wanting to burden a man who'd already lost so much with one more terrible thing. She asked me to protect myself, and to look harder at that doctor visit if anything ever felt wrong. I sat at that kitchen table and read the letter 3 times, tears running down my face, grief tangled up now with something colder and sharper settling into my chest. My niece had seen something coming, months before she ever got sick. She'd spent what turned out to be the last year of her life quietly building a case for a father figure she loved, without ever once burdening him with it while she still had the strength to carry it herself. The next morning, while I was still at Sam and Dolores's kitchen table, Curtis was already moving fast back at the house. Marcus, Rachel's old hospice coworker, happened to drive past Maple Crest on his way to work and saw a real estate agent's car parked in the driveway, along with a small yard sign that read, "Coming soon," with a photo of my house printed right on it. Curtis was putting my house on the market less than 24 hours after burying his wife, and less than a full day after telling me to leave it. What he didn't know was that Rachel's letter had told me exactly where to start looking. That same morning, I called an old friend of mine, a woman named Evelyn Suarez, who'd worked as an insurance fraud investigator for the state of North Carolina for close to 25 years, before retiring the year prior, though she still consulted privately on complicated cases. Evelyn had known Rachel since she was a little girl running around my backyard in Margaret's old sun hats. I told her everything: the funeral, the 30-day ultimatum, the letter, the insurance policy, the doctor visit Rachel had never heard of before Curtis scheduled it. Evelyn went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said, "Robert, I need you to send me copies of everything in that envelope today." Don't wait. Within 3 days, Evelyn had pulled threads I never would have known to look for. The doctor, Curtis, had insisted Rachel see, the one who'd ordered the policy's medical exam 18 months before her diagnosis, wasn't a licensed physician at all. He was a man named Dennis Whitfield, who'd lost his medical license in Tennessee 6 years earlier after a patient death tied to falsified records, and who had been operating under a different name doing independent medical exams for insurance applications ever since, a common scam used to push fraudulent policies through underwriting without proper scrutiny. Evelyn discovered that Curtis had paid Whitfield in cash for 2 separate exams that year, both of which conveniently cleared Rachel as a low-risk applicant for a policy nearly double what their previous coverage had been, filed only weeks before Rachel started reporting the symptoms that would eventually be diagnosed as cancer. Evelyn brought in a detective she'd worked alongside for years, a man named Detective Aaron Weller with the Asheville Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Weller pulled Whitfield's financial records and found the cash payments from Curtis matching almost exactly to the dates on the falsified exam paperwork. He also discovered, through subpoenaed phone records, hundreds of text messages between Curtis and the woman from his office, messages that stretched back nearly 2 years and grew increasingly explicit in discussing what Curtis called the timeline, how long it might take for a diagnosis to develop, how policies handled early cancer claims, how quickly he could sell a paid-off house once everything was settled. Detective Weller told Evelyn that between the falsified medical exam, the suspiciously timed policy increase, and the text messages laying out Curtis's own words in his own handwriting, there was more than enough for a warrant, both for insurance fraud and, pending a deeper look from the district attorney's office, for something far more serious tied to whether Curtis had known about or influenced the timeline of Rachel's diagnosis in any deliberate way. Weller was careful to tell Evelyn that proving intent behind an illness itself would be an uphill legal battle, but the fraud alone, the falsified medical documentation used to push through a $750,000 policy, was rock solid and completely provable on paper. 3 weeks after the funeral, on a Tuesday evening, Federal insurance fraud agents working alongside Detective Weller's unit were waiting in the driveway on Maple Crest when Curtis pulled in from work. Marcus, who still lived 2 streets over and happened to be driving home at the same time, told me later that Curtis sat frozen behind the wheel of his car for almost a full minute before an agent finally walked up and knocked on his window. He was brought in for questioning that same evening, along with Dennis Whitfield, who was picked up separately at a motel outside Knoxville 2 days later once agents tracked down his current alias. Within 2 weeks, Curtis was formally charged with insurance fraud, filing falsified medical documentation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Charges that under North Carolina law carried the possibility of real prison time given the size of the policy involved. Whitfield was charged separately with practicing medicine without a license and multiple counts of falsifying medical records, on top of an outstanding warrant that had been sitting unserved from his time in Tennessee. The district attorney's office spent several more months reviewing whether there was any provable connection between the falsified exam and the actual onset of Rachel's illness. But in the end, they couldn't establish that Whitfield's fraudulent exam had caused or hidden anything medical, only that it had been used to push through a policy under false pretenses. It was, Evelyn told me gently, probably a mercy in disguise, because it meant I never had to sit through a trial trying to prove whether the man Rachel married had somehow orchestrated her cancer itself. A question none of us could ever fully answer, and one I've made my own peace with leaving alone. The house on Maple Crest was never legally Curtis's to sell in the first place, and once the fraud investigation confirmed the deed had always been in my name, the real estate listing was pulled entirely, with the agent, a woman named Priya Anand, canceling everything the moment she learned about the fraud charges attached to the seller. She told Evelyn she wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of it. I moved back into my own house on a quiet Thursday afternoon in July, almost exactly 1 month after I'd walked out with nothing but a duffel bag and a metal safe under my arm. Sam and Dolores helped me carry boxes back inside, and that evening Marcus showed up with a casserole dish. Rachel had apparently given his wife the recipe for years earlier, the same kind of quiet neighborhood kindness that Street had always shown me. Curtis eventually took a plea deal on the fraud charges, avoiding the maximum sentence, but still receiving 4 years in a state facility, along with a permanent felony record and a court order to repay the policy's underwriting fees. Whitfield received a longer sentence given his prior offenses. Neither of them ever contacted me again, and I never once reached out to either of them. Some evenings I still sit in the same recliner in the living room, the same chair I was sitting in the day Curtis leaned down and told me to be out in 30 days, and I think about Rachel. I think about how, even while she was losing weight and losing strength and losing time she should have had left, she still found the energy to build a case, quietly, patiently, to protect an old man who'd already lost everyone else he'd ever really loved. That envelope in my closet wasn't just paperwork. It was the last thing my niece ever gave me, finished and sealed months before either of us understood how badly it would be needed. I lost my daughter in every way that mattered except blood, and nothing will ever fill that particular emptiness in this house. But I kept the roof, Margaret, and I built our life under. And more than that, I got to keep the truth of exactly who Rachel was, right up until her very last breath. If this story moved you the way it still moves me every time I tell it, I'd be grateful if you'd stick around for the next one, because there are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be heard the whole way through.